second, but Vanessa asked me to come and do a presentation about Agile in the real world. Let me share my slides here real quick. So hopefully you're in the right place. If you're wondering what Agile is or wondering what the real world is, then stick around and maybe we'll see if you're in the right place or not. But we wanted to start just by talking about, I guess you've been learning a little bit about Agile software development methodologies. And kind of my goal here is to talk about not really the nuts and bolts of exactly how to do Agile. There's lots of books out there, there's lots of websites, there's lots of consultants, there's lots of resources to learn exactly how to do them. So the focus of my talk more is how does that translate to the real world? That's why I put the little TM on there as a joke. You know, once you get out in the real world in different companies, how does this look, this idea of Agile methodologies? And the main thing we'll talk about, I'm getting ahead of myself, but the main thing is it really varies. Everybody does it differently, and that's okay. So I'm not going to give you the consultant view of it. They're trying to sell you something. I'm not trying to sell you anything. And the answer is there's lots of ways to do Agile, and most of them are okay. So as we talk about Agile, you know, in the real world, it looks more like this often. You have, you know, a good idea, and does it work well? Well, sometimes. Sometimes it works great, sometimes it doesn't. So let me start at the beginning. Who am I? Like I said, my name is Nathan Talbert. I live in Illinois in the United States. I don't know how familiar you are with the United States geography, but I'm kind of smack dab in the middle of the United States, kind of a high-tech town in a rural area. We're surrounded by farmland. I've lived here most of my life, other than a couple of years living in southern China. And I've spent 20 plus years doing professional software development. Before that, I first got involved with programming when I was pretty young. My parents bought us a Texas Instruments TI 99-4A computer when I was about 8 years old. And it came with this book called Beginner's Basic. And I thought it was the most interesting thing I'd ever seen in my life. And being able to do a little silly program where you type, you know, 10, print, Nathan is cool, go to 10, I thought was the greatest thing I'd ever seen. And so pretty much from that point on, I knew I wanted to do software development for my job when I grew up. So luckily, that's what I went to school to do. I went to the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and I'm still there now. So like I said, I've done 20 plus years working with different teams doing software development and quite a few different roles and different projects. You know, I've been just a developer down in the trenches. I've been a project manager, kind of separated away from the technical side and just directing things. I've been a team lead where you're kind of doing a bit of both, the project management and the development side of things. The architect role where you're just planning the high level view of all the code. So a lot of different types of experience that I've had over these years. Currently, I'm a lead research programmer at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, which sounds really fancy. Basically, what that means is we're part of the University of Illinois that provides supercomputers, high performance computers, to make them available for scientists to do research. So we have a few different machines, and my role and Sergio's role that works with me is to develop software tools that help researchers request allocations on these supercomputers so they can do their research, and then reviewers review it and approve it, and they can get time on supercomputers. So that's what I do professionally. And then on the side, I've got a side gig that I am a retro video game developer. So for fun, I like to make video games for the really old video game systems. The old Atari 2600, which is older than I am. It's probably 45 years old right now. I like to write code for it, or the Nintendo Entertainment System, the old 8-bit NES. I like to make games for those. And believe it or not, there are still people that buy them. So my side hobby actually makes me just a little bit of money, although not very much. A fun tidbit about that is it's so different from doing professional software development. If I'm working on the Atari 2600, for example, the Atari had 128 bytes of RAM. So any program that you're running, you had to think about how do you store the whole state of the game in 128 bytes. I was working on a game a few years ago, and I was almost done, and I realized I didn't have any sound in the game. And so I thought, okay, I need to be able to build kind of a sound engine for this game. And I looked and I realized I only have 2 bytes of RAM free to hold the state of my sound engine. So it's a little bit of a different world on that sort of thing, being able to develop and plan and build when you're on such limited restraints. But that's actually why I really enjoy it. It's a fun difference from my day-to-day job. So that out of the way, let's talk about Agile itself. What is Agile? So you've probably learned a little bit about this, but I say Agile is really a response to an older methodology of doing software development, which was called waterfall. And the stuffy bureaucrats in suits did this at the big organizations back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, where they would have somebody in a room. The big business people would design every little detail of the application, what it was supposed to do, and then they'd hand it off to the next room. And the people in the next room would break it into chunks and assign you a very clear specification of what you were supposed to do. And then you as a developer would get this clear specification, and you'd go into a cave for 6 months and you'd write your pieces of it, and then all the developers would get together and put their pieces, and then testing would begin. And it was this very rigorous, formal process where one piece starts, and then you do the next piece, and then you do the next piece. And 3 years later, you emerge with a software product that met the specifications, and by that point, it may or may not be useful anymore because maybe the specifications didn't really match up with what was needed in the business anymore. And so over time, they found that this system was not necessarily the best. I had some experience with this. One of my first jobs was an internship with Walmart with their home office. And it was not really a fun job because it worked kind of like this. I would be sitting in my cubicle and somebody would come along with this very clear specification of here's the program you need to write, pixel by pixel, exactly what displays where, exactly what inputs go in, exactly what inputs come out. And I would implement that and hand it off to somebody else, and it would go to the formal testing team and then to the formal deployment team. And you felt like a cog in the machine, and I don't know who designed these things, and I don't know how they were used. And let me tell you, it was one of the least satisfying jobs I've ever had. So my experience with the old waterfall method was not very enjoyable. That said, I don't know very many companies that actually do this. Almost every company now is using some form of Agile. So what is Agile? So in the early 2000s, a bunch of guys got together at some retreat. These were people who do conferences, write books about programming and methodologies, those sorts of people. And they got together and they said, we need something different. And they came out with what they call the Agile Manifesto, which is a big document that I'm not going to read to you. You can look it up. But basically was saying that old way of doing development is not very useful because it is overly formal and doesn't give a chance to really get a product to market quickly, to value who your customer is and have a cycle with them to iterate on things. You're so glued to the plan that you don't really respond to changes. So they wrote this big manifesto, and I have these bullet points are some of a summary of it. The idea is that what's more important than your formal process is your individuals and your interactions, being able to talk with your stakeholders or your customers, being able to iterate on that. They value a working product over comprehensive documentation. So it's more important that you have some product that you can demonstrate that it works, and then you iterate on it. And that's more important than fully documenting from the beginning to the end exactly how this product is going to work, and then you turn around and build it. Similarly, they value customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Instead of having a very formal spec up front and you say, this is going to cost you $10,000 or whatever, instead, you have a cycle of, they say, here's what we think we want. And you build something that looks sort of like it. And you bring it back and say, hey, is this really what you want? And you iterate on that. And at the end, you hope to have a better product. Similarly, responding to changes. If your software takes you 5 years to build, like I said, by the end, the world has changed in those 5 years. The world of tech moves quickly. So instead of focusing on just strictly following a plan, they have a goal of you can respond to changes. If you see that the market has changed a little bit as you're developing it, you can pivot, you can change. And so these are some of the important ideas that they had in this Agile methodology. And when they released this, the whole world said, yes, this is what we need. Now, that's Agile on paper. Again, I'm going to talk today about the difference between kind of Agile on paper versus Agile in the real world. So this all sounded really great. But as you can see, these specifications or this idea of Agile is a little bit vague. They didn't really specify, here's how you did it. They just specified on paper, kind of the priorities of Agile, what the goals were. And so when we talk about Agile in the real world, it kind of means whatever we want it to mean. It's a reaction against that bureaucratic waterfall process. But what that really looks like is as varied as the different crayons in a crayon box. Anything from, I've had teams where there's almost no process at all, and they say, we're agile because we're not overly rigorous, to teams that are very formal, not quite waterfall, but pretty formal in their methodology. And all of those, because agile is just a vague idea, can get lumped into the idea of what is agile development. So is that good or bad that it's so vague? It can be good or bad. But one of the things that I really want to focus on kind of in this talk is that out in the real world, different companies, different software teams are going to implement agile differently. It's going to look different, and that's okay. The goal, because I'm going back a slide, because of this idea that we're focusing on individuals and interactions more so than processes and tools, means that the difference in what your agile workflow looks like is fine. As long as you are focusing on that idea of being able to iterate on something quickly and develop a quality software product, that's okay. So why agile? I talked a little bit about this early on. What's the difference between the waterfall? Why was that bad? Why are we moving to something that's better? So going back to on paper, here's all the reasons why agile is good. First, you have this better feedback loop to respond to stakeholder requests. That was what I was talking about before. If your customer, whether your customer is actually like an end customer or whether it's somebody else in your organization, whether it's your boss, whoever it is, if your customer says, that's not quite right, you can have this nice feedback loop where you iterate on something, present it. That looks pretty good, but tweak this. Okay, you go back to the drawing board a little bit, you iterate, and it gives this nice feedback loop because often your stakeholders don't really know what they want in the first place. I've definitely been part of organizations where the customer requests something and you build it exactly like what they request and you give it back to them and they say, this is terrible. And you say, well, yeah, of course it's terrible. I thought it was terrible from the very beginning. So the goal is to reduce that and instead be able to take their ideas and iterate on them. Similarly, another reason for why agile is better than something like a waterfall process is a faster minimum viable product. That's a word that gets tossed around a lot in the tech industry, minimum viable product. And the idea of that is to have the very simplest version of your application that you can deliver and say, to some extent, it's done. For example, if somebody came along and said, you need to write a graphics editing application, you're not going to go for your very first iteration on it and have Photoshop with all the millions of features that Photoshop has. So a minimum viable product is going to be, what is the very smallest thing that you can deliver and say, I have a working graphics editor. I need to be able to paint graphics on the screen and load them and save them. That's your minimum viable product. And then once you have that, you can look at the market or look at your organization and say, what do we need to keep adding to improve it? But that way you can have a product that maybe you can deliver in 3 months instead of the 8 to 10 years it would take you to recreate Photoshop. Another reason why agile, it's more fun. I mentioned that job I had at Walmart was miserable. I was so bored taking these specifications and implementing exactly this many rows and columns, and this form has to be exactly here. As developers, we all like to have some creativity, and agile gives you room to have some creativity. Similarly, less bureaucratic overhead. You're not spending all your time worrying about this specification exactly being on this format, and you have to match this format for the specification and have it modeled in UML, and you remove some of that bureaucracy to try to move quickly and develop a good product. And hopefully that turns into the next bullet point, which is more productive teams. It may not always turn into more productive teams. We'll talk about that on the real world version of this page. But the goal is that it makes you more productive. And once again, that last bullet point, which I think is the key thing that I keep coming back to, if you only take one thing away from my talk, it's this: the people over the processes. Waterfall, formalize the process is what's important. And in Agile, even though many guides will tell you, this is how to do it, this is how to do it, this is how to do it, really the goal and the thing that makes Agile valuable is that you're taking organic people and interactions and prioritizing that over a formal process. And that's what's important here, because that allows us to iterate quickly, to understand what people want, to work with people, and both the customers and your teams are going to be happier if you take the people over processes. The world is made up of people, and if we reduce the world to processes and tech, that removes all the human element. And let's face it, we are humans, and that's a good thing. So that's why Agile, at least on paper. So in the real world, why do we like to do Agile? Well, all the reasons from the last slide are true. But also, like I said before, because Agile is such a loose label, it encompasses so many ways of organizing a project that in the real world, most organizations I work with are using Agile because it's this big umbrella term that can mean almost anything. You know, I've had teams where our process was pretty informal. That's Agile. I've had teams where we stuck to a pretty strict Scrum methodology. That's Agile. So it's easy to say we're using Agile when it's such a big encompassing term. So I talked about the idea that now that it's this big umbrella, this big encompassing term, there are many different actual ways of doing it. There are more ways of doing Agile than I have fingers on my hand. I looked up online and I found lists and lists of them. So I just wrote a few of them down on this paper. You know, there's Scrum, which is one of the most popular. There's Kanban. There's XP, which is extreme programming. There's Lean, and there's feature-driven development, which is FDD. There's Crystal. I don't even know what Crystal is. I've never heard of Crystal until I've made this list of what are different Agile methodologies. And I left some of them off this list because I've never heard of half of these things. Every single one of these has an army of consultants and people who consider themselves experts that will try to sell you books and sell you seminars and sell you courses to learn to do this methodology the best. And that's okay. I'm not saying that's bad. But if we focus on that formality of how do I master this particular methodology, I think we lose some of the real world big picture, which is you take these as a starting point and make them work for your team, because that's the point of Agile. The point of Agile is the people over that process. And so I think often companies make a mistake where they focus on, am I doing this methodology right? Well, don't worry about right. Worry about, is it working for your software team? So in a little bit, I'm going to get into a little bit more detail and talk about two of these, Scrum and Kanban. They're two of the most popular ones, and I'll talk a little bit more about how I've seen them work in the real world or how teams often use them. So we'll get a little bit more into the weeds with those. But before I do, I just wanted to reiterate that point that what I'm showing you as far as how we've used it is not necessarily how you need to use it. It's in the real world, here's one company that used it this way, but your experience can vary, and that's good. So it brings me to my real world slide about Agile methodologies, which I kind of got ahead of myself and talked about, which is find a method that works for your team. Pick one of those Agile methodologies, tweak it, adapt it, make it work for you. That's people over process. Because if you don't do that, then you're going to be chained to the methodology. And I've seen so many discussions online where people say, we tried Scrum and it was a disaster, and we followed all of the exact details of it. Why was it a disaster? And the answer is, you didn't adapt it to your team. You didn't adapt it to what works for you. You were stuck on the process over the people. And so in the real world, the answer is do what works for you. So let's dive into a couple of these methodologies. And some of these you may have read more about. Some of you might be more experts than I am, because I've only had the experiences that I've had. I haven't experienced all of them. So let's talk about Scrum. Scrum is one of the most popular ways of doing Agile development, and it's pretty flexible. There are some core features of it, and beyond that, you can change it, make it work for your team. So one of the core ideas of Scrum is the idea of sprints, which is let me back up a little bit. What's good about a sprint is that the problem we had before was that sometimes when you're doing software development with no organization, you'd have one of two problems. Either one, you'd go away in your developer cave for 9 months and then nobody knows if anybody's making any progress. You have no idea how things are improving. The project manager has no visibility into the progress as it flows in the project. And then everybody gets back together after 9 months and maybe Bob over here hasn't done anything, where Alice has done and you don't know what to do next. The other opposite extreme is that there's no organization to it whatsoever, and the manager says, Sergio, you need to start working on this. And then tomorrow Sergio says, actually, we have a higher, or the manager says to Sergio, actually, we have a higher priority. Stop what you're doing. Switch over here and do this instead. And then 2 days later, the manager comes to Sergio and says, hold on. We've got a bug. Drop everything. Do this instead. And there's no flow. You can't get it into a flow when everything is changing every 5 minutes. So Scrum and the idea of sprints is to counteract both of those. The idea is you have a set amount of time. Usually it's maybe 2 weeks or a week, where at the beginning of the sprint, everybody gets the marching orders. This is the task or tasks that you're going to work on for the sprint, these 2 weeks. And these tasks are divided into small enough chunks that we expect that you're going to be done at the end of those 2 weeks. So part of the work is for the Scrum Master or the project manager or whoever, to divide tasks appropriately, that you can start it at the beginning of those 2 weeks and end it. And so it's kind of like the idea of a real life sprint. You run hard for a little while and then you stop. So the idea being, here's what you're going to do. We do it. And at the end of those 2 weeks, you say it's done. Another feature of that is we start with the idea of stories, user stories. So instead of just trying to break the project up into immediately saying, here's your task, here's your task, here's your task, a story is a little bit more high level. It's what is a feature or something that a user is going to want to do in this software. So if I'm going back to the graphics editor, a story might be, Alice wants to come in and load a ping file and save it as a JPEG file. That's kind of a user story. So then you think about, okay, what are features that we need to implement for that? So you start with the story and you turn it into actual tasks. Well, actual tasks might be, one person needs to develop a ping importer and another person needs to develop a JPEG exporter. And so when you start your sprint, you could say, okay, Sergio is going to work on the ping importer and Vanessa is going to work on the JPEG exporter. We have 2 weeks, let's go. Another feature of Scrum is sprint planning and backlog refinement. And that relates to this idea of stories. So you have a meeting once a week. Your backlog refinement meeting is what it's usually called, where you take all of these stories, all these tasks that are in your backlog. Your backlog is all the things you haven't done yet. And you estimate, how long is each one of these going to take? Do we need to break it into subtasks, or is this a good single task by itself? How can we break these down into tasks that can actually be accomplished in 2 weeks? And then part of that is that estimation. There's lots of different processes for doing that estimation. Some people have a thing called poker, what do they call it? Planning poker, where different people in your group almost bid for how hard they think things are going to be. There's lots of other tools that you can use for that backlog refinement and that estimation. And I won't get into all of those because there's a lot of variety in there. And then at the beginning, before you do your sprint, you have a sprint planning meeting, which is basically that assignment of tasks. Nathan's going to take this one. Sergio's going to take this one. Vanessa's going to take these two. And so you assign them all out at the beginning of your 2 weeks. And then you say, go. And at the end of the 2 weeks, you see how it went. Another feature of Scrum is this idea. You have one person, which is the Scrum Master. They love to give new terms and fancy terminology to this. Really, that's sort of a project manager. But the idea of this is somebody whose job it is to make sure that obstacles are cleared so that people can get their work done. If Sergio comes to me and says, I'm stuck on this because I really need the new database and the new database isn't done, if I'm the Scrum Master, it's my job to go hunt down who's doing the new database and help Sergio get unblocked so he can keep going. And the Scrum Master is also the one that coordinates all these meetings, that keeps everything on track. Now, another feature of Scrum, and it's also a feature of many Agile methodologies, it's very popular these days, is a stand-up meeting or a daily Scrum. And whether that's actually daily or whether it's a few times a week, the kind of project I'm on, we do it Monday, Wednesday, Friday mornings. But the idea of this is a very fast meeting, which is why it's called a stand-up. The idea is that you shouldn't even have to sit down because it's that quick of a meeting. If everybody's sitting down, your meeting is probably taking too long. This isn't a long status update where everybody talks through everything they're doing and it takes 30 minutes. What this is you get all of your developers in a room and say, everything going okay? Who's stuck? Who needs help? Is there any issues on what you've been working on? In our meetings, we have about 10 people, and this meeting often takes between 5 and 10 minutes, depending on whether people have issues or not. The idea is not to hash everything out, to have long design discussions, but to really make sure if somebody's stuck, everybody understands, here's why they're stuck, and Alice over here can come help you. Or if you have a question, you can hash it out real quick at the end of the meeting with just the 2 or 3 people that matter. So it's just a chance for everybody to sync up, make sure everything's moving okay. So those are many of the core features of Scrum. Again, how that works in reality is going to vary for your team. Your daily meetings, you might have them daily, you might have them 3 times a week, you might have them twice a week. Whether or not you actually focus on user stories, translating them to tasks, or whether you just start with tasks, that may vary. The length of your sprints, how your backlog refinement works, how you assign things in sprints, all of those things really can vary. There's going to be people telling you this is how you have to do it, but in the real world, every company does them a little bit differently. I'm going to pause there. I'm going to take time for questions at the end, but specifically about Scrum, did anybody have any questions specifically about how that works? All right, I'm going to go on. If you have any questions, or if you want to think about it, if you have any questions, I can take them at the end. Another popular methodology is Kanban. It comes from a Japanese process that they use in the automotive industry, really, and that's been adapted for software development. In some ways, it's similar to Scrum. Many of the features are the same as far as having small tasks that you can track in short amounts of time, kind of having, a quick iteration of cycles. But one difference in Kanban is we don't focus on that sprint. One of the weaknesses we found in a Scrum methodology, we used to do Scrum for a while on the team I'm on, and people got tired of it because one of the weaknesses is it can be really difficult to shove everything into this 2-week point. Some tasks, they really are going to take you 2 months, and there's no way to break it down into something smaller. Or sometimes you feel this artificial deadline of what's so sacred about this 2-week boundary, and now I'm really stressed out on the Thursday before the end of the 2 weeks because I have to be able to say my task was done, even if really it should take me 4 more days to do it well. And so there was we found some unnecessary pressure in those 2-week sprints. So it works really well for some teams. For our team, it was just adding extra stress to the developers. So we switched to Kanban, which is really more of a continuous process. Instead of focusing on you have to have your task done at the end of this sprint and then you'll get a new task, you still meet and evaluate regularly. We still have a 2-week cycle where we meet and evaluate what are the upcoming tasks and which ones got done, but there's less of a sense of we have to have this task pared down small enough to be completed in exactly 2 weeks. Instead, you have a board. Some people do it with an actual board with sticky notes. Usually now people do software tools to manage it, and I'll show you one of those in a minute. But a board where you track, each card or each sticky note or each virtual card is a task, and you have maybe one for each person in a category, and you move them. This is to do, this is now in progress, this is now maybe in review, and so you can see over time as they flow they need to go from to do to done. And so having that idea of this board where you track a task from to do to completion, but it's a continuous process. My cards might take me 3 weeks to get through, where Sergio might be working on some small tasks that he gets done 3 of them a day. That's okay. We're not slaves to the 2-week sprint cycle. I'm going to talk a little bit and show you a little bit about how that's actually done in our organization, because that's what we're using now. So we use a product called Jira. You might be familiar with it. It's a commercial bug tracking, issue tracking, and project management software. So this is our Kanban board for what we're doing. So we have an in progress column over here, and each of these boxes is a card that somebody's working on. And our goal, which we don't always do, because you can see that this person, Rebecca here, has 2 at once. But our goal in general is each person has 1 active thing at a time. That way, everything is moving. You're not working on 6 things at the same time and one of them gets stalled out. You pick one and you work on it for a while. And then as you're working on it, maybe you're blocked by something. I can't get any more progress on this done until Joe over here finishes his part. So you move it into the blocked tab or the blocked column. And then when you're close to being done with it, you can move it over into peer review, and somebody else in our team is going to do a code review of it. And then when we're done with that, we move it over to done. So as the project manager, I can come in here and at a glance see what everybody's working on and the status of everything without some of the okay, what is this sprint going to look like? So we found this methodology to be really useful. At the same time, we also have our backlog, which looks a lot like Scrum, which is this is our list of everything out there that is still to do. So we have, all sorts of issues in our backlog. These are all of the things that we've identified as things we want to do in the future. And so once every 2 weeks or so, we have similarly to Scrum, we have a backlog refinement meeting where we look through the backlog and say, which ones are highest priority? Which ones do we need to bubble up to the front? Which ones are going to take a long time? So we can drag and drop them, and this one here, okay, this one's more important. So we drag it up a little bit and we can assign somebody to it now. So they know when they've finished off their next tasks or what they're working on now, they can grab one of these from the backlog, throw it into in progress, and it'll appear on this board. And then they can start working through it on the board. So we found this using Kanban to be flexible enough that we don't feel like we're chained to the methodology, but at the same time, it helps us get a high level view of what's everybody working on. And during those backlog meetings, we work with our stakeholders, our customer basically, and say, hey, which of these are important to you? Which of these do we need to prioritize? And do we understand your requirements well enough to implement it now? Sometimes during that backlog meeting, we open up an issue and say, we would love to work on this now, but what you're proposing doesn't really make any sense. And so that gives us a time during that meeting to iterate back and forth and say, what if we do it this way? What if we do it that way? And they can say, yeah, that's a good option. And then once we have it kind of hashed out, we assign it to somebody and it bubbles up to the top of the backlog and somebody will soon be working on it. So that is how we use Kanban. So that's really the bulk of what I wanted to talk about this morning, kind of those examples. But once again, I'm coming back to my main point that I mentioned over and over again. You're only doing Agile wrong if it doesn't work for you. If a consultant says, no, your Scrum Master needs to be having this meeting this way, but it's working for you, tell them to go away. If you're worried about, am I following this process exactly right? Don't worry about it. The question is it working well for your team and for your stakeholders so that you're making process, you're iterating well, you're focusing on that idea of people over process? Is the way you've adapted Agile letting you understand what your stakeholders need, quickly respond to what they need, and organize your team so that everybody knows what they're working on and making progress? And if so, in the real world, that's a good Agile methodology without focusing on, I am stuck following this one way of doing it. So that's the main thing I wanted to drive home today. So I appreciate you listening. I think we still have a little bit of time, so I'm going to stop sharing my slides. And if anybody has questions about Agile methodologies or how my company does them or my experience with software development or anything I've done, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Pablo have some questions, I think.
Sí. Hi, and good morning.
Hi.
I have a few questions. Has the Agile methodology been easier in this time of pandemic due to the number of communication channels that currently exist? Do you think it would have been more difficult in an era with less technology?
It definitely would have been more difficult with less technology. I mean, doing it remotely would have been more difficult with less technology. I think that, if you're all in the same building, there's a lot of ways of doing these processes that work more manually with less technology. I have one coworker that actually on the front of his office door has sticky notes as a Kanban board and organizes things that way. So you can do a lot, less technological. But now during COVID and we're all at home, yeah, I think it would have been very difficult without a lot of these tools that we have right now. I mean, Zoom has made it very easy for us to have our regular stand-up meeting, and Slack has made it really easy to coordinate outside of that, to say, hey, I have this issue, I'm stuck here, And if we need to, then we can pop into a Zoom meeting to talk about it further. So yeah, I think it's been interesting with COVID, to say the least. That said, I think that having a good methodology going into COVID was important for us, because otherwise, once you're all at home and you can't be in the same room, if you don't have established ways of doing your development communication, suddenly you had to learn new ways of doing it. So I think it was helpful for us that we had a process first before going into COVID that worked for us. I hope that answered your question.
And I have another one.
Sure.
And if you don't have synergy with your team, it could be possible to make a project go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the last part of your question.
And if you don't have synergy with your team, it could be possible make a project go ahead.
It's always possible. So you're asking, if you don't have good synergy with your team, is it still possible to make progress? Is that what you're asking? Did I understand correctly?
I think this is the question.
Okay. I mean, the answer is always you can make progress. You can still make it happen, but without a good synergy with your team, you're just going to be less productive. There's always teams where you might not have full synergy and somebody may not be communicating well or pulling their weight, and you're not as productive as you otherwise could have been. That said, there's always a way forward whether you have synergy or not. So yes and no. You're going to be much more productive if you have good synergy with these methodologies and if your team's on board working together and you're communicating well. Does that mean you can't move forward? I don't know. I've definitely been on dysfunctional teams and everything took a lot longer than it needed to.
Another question for anyone else? I have one.
Sure.
And we are implementing Scrum in our subject or with our student, but we have problem because the student said, as you say, it's very stressful because they have to wait only to work or to make the improvement and the next step of your sprint. So maybe in your opinion, it's better to implement Kanban in this kind of student project or continue with the Scrum, because we try to make a retrospective and so on and try to improve the next step in order to make some arrangement in our team and try to improve this work that they do.
So I'm not sure if I'm in a position to tell you what's better for your team. One thing that I have been told over and over again with Scrum, I haven't experienced it, but I've heard, is that it works better if people understand that the goal is to finish it in the 2 weeks, but we're not making people feel guilty or have this extreme pressure. If you don't get it done within that time, that wasn't necessarily a failure of you as a developer to get it done. It might have been a failure of the team to properly estimate it and to properly schedule it. And so instead of just increasing the pressure and saying, work harder to get it done in the 2 weeks, another solution is to, as part of your retrospective, to come back and say, we estimated that wrong. We realized it's going to take longer than it needed to. How can we as a team improve our estimation? Now, I still feel like there's a lot of room for, but I still feel that pressure on Thursday to get it done. So it depends on the personalities of your people. That's why we switched to Kanban, and that's why I prefer Kanban. But I think there's times that the 2-week sprints are really helpful, especially if you do have tight deadlines and you need to deliver a product by this certain amount of time. The sprint can really help you kind of organize it into, we think we can get this done. Yeah. So I think there's pros and cons, but I would highly recommend to try to find ways to avoid unnecessary pressure to complete a task in a certain amount of time.
Thank you. Another question? You can write in the chat and I can translate if you want. Maybe no one else.
That's all right.
Maybe it was too clear, the presentation, Nathan.
And if you do have questions, I'm going to put my email address in the, oh, I don't know if I can chat to everybody or not.
Yes, I think. Let me.
I'll say I can put my email address in the chat, and you can feel free to email me if you have any questions. I'd be happy to answer. It looks like I can
Now
only...
you can't.
Oh, now I can. All right. That's my email address. Feel free to send me any questions that you have, and I'll do my best to answer, or we'll see.
Our English is not the best, so
I understand. I actually worked for a software company in China for 2 years, and so I got some experience with people that, you know, my Chinese is not very good. Their English was not very good, so I've definitely experienced working in that language barrier. So no problem.
with Chinese is very difficult to try to understand.
And you are practicing your accent reduction with me.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. For me, it's difficult to understand Sergio in Spanish, so in English is worse.
Well, I will leave you with a story. One thing, this is not related to Agile, but just as people that are planning on going into software development, my one thing that I like to tell people is, in your career, you will break things and you will mess things up. I want to tell you 2 stories about times that I've broken things in my career, and just to tell you that that's okay. I started a position and where I'm working now, but a different role in it. And in the first couple days of that position, we were having a big review by all of the government people that were funding the project. They were doing a review. And they said, Nathan, can you add permissions for one more person to be able to view the documentation? So I went in to change the permissions. And instead of adding the one person, I accidentally deleted every single person. And so the big government review was just stuck. So it was not a good day. Similarly, I'll tell you about when I worked for Walmart. That was an internship, but we were writing software that would be deployed to all of the store management computers. And so one day I wrote my program, tested it, deployed it out to production, and I went home that night. The next day I came in and my coworkers were all tired and angry because they had been there all night long, because it turns out my code had a bug that I didn't know about, and it broke all of the store computers in the country of Canada. And so their management computers were all broken, and so everyone was there overnight trying to fix it. So I wasn't fired for either of those. So I just want to encourage you that in your careers, you will make mistakes, you will break things, and that's okay. Stick with it.
Go ahead.
I will take that word.
Yep.
Sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work.
Exactly. Well, I thank you for letting me come and talk to you. Good luck in your education and your careers coming up. And like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email and ask.
Thank you very much for coming. We are really appreciate that you made this lecture for us.
No problem.
And also for everything that you said. And it's very useful, for sure.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
Nathan. Thank you.